Chapter 9, Part 2, Dede, 1994 and 1960, pages 182 through 192. As the day drew closer, Dede was beset by doubts, particularly when she thought about her boys, Enrique, Rafael, David. How could she possibly leave them? Jaimito would never let her keep them. He was more than possessive with his sons, claiming them as if they were parts of himself. Look at how he had named them all with his first name as well as his last. Jaime Enrique Fernandez, Jaime Rafael Fernandez, Jaime David Fernandez. Only their middle names, which perforce became their given names, were their own. It wasn't just that she couldn't bear losing her boys, although that in itself was a dread large enough to stop her in her tracks. She also couldn't desert them. Who would stand between them and the raised hand when their father lost his temper? Who would make them mangou the way that they liked it, cut their hair so that it looked right, and sit in the dark with them when they were scared and the next morning not remind them that she had been there? She needed to talk to someone outside her sisters, the priest. She'd gotten lax in her church attendance, and the new militancy from the pulpit had become like so much noise in a place that you had come to hear soothing music. But now that noise seemed in harmony with what she was feeling inside. Maybe this new young priest, Padre de Jesus, would have an answer for her. She arranged for a ride that Friday with Mama's new neighbors, Don Bernardo and his wife, Doña Belen, old Spaniards who had been living down in San Cristobal for years. They had decided to move to the countryside. Don Bernardo explained, hoping the air would help Doña Belen. Something was wrong with the frail old woman, and she was forgetting the simplest things. What a fork was for, how to button her dress. Was it the seed or the meat of the mango you could eat? Don Bernardo was taking her to Salcedo for yet another round of tests at the clinic. "We won't be coming back until late afternoon. I hope that won't inconvenience you very much," he apologized. The man was astonishingly courtly. "Not at all," Dede assured him. "She could just be dropped off at the church." "What have you got to do all day in church?" Doña Belen had disconcerting ability to suddenly tune in quite clearly, especially to what was none of her business. "Community work," Dede lied. "You Mirabel girls are so civic-minded," Don Bernardo observed. No doubt he was thinking of Minerva, or his favorite, Patria. It was harder to satisfy Jaimito's suspicions. "If you need to go to Salcedo, I'll take you tomorrow." He had come into the bedroom as she was getting dressed that Friday morning. "Jaimito, por Dios," she pleaded. He had already forbidden her to go about with her sisters. Was he now going to keep her from accompanying a poor old woman to the doctor? "Since when had Doña Belen been a preoccupation of yours?" Then he said the thing he knew would make her feel the guiltiest. "And what about leaving the boys when they're sick?" "All they have is colds, for God's sakes. And Tanita's here with them." Jaimito blinked in surprise at her sharp tone. Was it really this easy, Dede wondered, taking command? "Do as you please, then," and he was giving her little knowing nods and his hands curling into fists. "But remember, you're going over my head." Jaimito did not return her wave as they drove away from Ojo de Agua. Something threatening in his look scared her, but Dede kept reminding herself she need not be afraid. She was going to be leaving him. She told herself to keep that in mind. No one answered her knock at the rectory, although she kept coming back every half hour, all morning long. In between times, she idled in shops, remembering Jaimito's look that morning and feeling her resolve draining away. At noon, when everything closed up, she sat under a shade tree in the square and fed the pieces of the pastry that she'd bought to the pigeons. Once, she thought she saw Jaimito's pickup, and she began making up stories for why she had strayed from Doña Belen at the clinic. Mid-afternoon, she spotted a green panel truck pulling up to the rectory gates. Padre de Jesus was in the passenger seat, and another man was driving. A third jumped out from the back, unlocked the courtyard gates, and closed them after the truck pulled in. Dede hurried across the street. There was only little time left before she had to meet up with Don Bernardo and Doña Belen at the clinic. And she had to talk to the priest. All day, the yeses and nos had been swirling inside her faster, until she felt dizzy with indecision. Waiting on that bench, she had promised herself that the priest's answer would decide it once and for all. She knocked several times before Padre de Jesus finally came to the door. Many apologies. He was unloading the truck and hadn't heard the knocker until just now. Please, please come in. He would be right with her. He left her sitting in the small vestibule while he finished up with the delivery they could hear going on in the adjoining choir room. Over his shoulder as he departed, Dede caught a glimpse of some pine boxes half covered by a tarpaulin. Something about their color and their long shape recalled an incident in Patria's house last fall. Dede had come over to help paint the baby's room. She had gone into Norris's room in search of some old sheets to lay on the floor, and there, in the closet, hidden behind a row of dresses, she'd seen several boxes just like these, standing on end. Patria had come in acting very nervous, stammering about those boxes being full of new tools. Not too long after, when Patria had come with her request to hide some boxes, Dede had understood what tools were inside of them. My God, Padre de Jesus was one of them. He would encourage her to join the struggle. Of course he would. And she knew right then and there, her knees shaking and her breath coming short, that she could not go through with this business. Jaimito was just an excuse. She was afraid. Plain and simple. Just as she had been afraid to face her powerful feelings for Leo. Instead, she had married Jaimito, although she knew that she did not love him enough. And here she'd always berated him for his failures in business when the greater bankruptcy had been on her part. She told herself that she was going to be late for her rendezvous. She ran out of the rectory before the priest could return and arrived at the clinic while Doña Belen was still struggling with the buttons of her dress. She heard the terrible silence the minute that she walked in the house. His pickup hadn't been in the drive, but then he often took off after a workday for a drink with his buddies. However, this silence was too deep and wide to be made by just one absence. Enrique? She screamed, running from room to room. Raphael? David! The boys' rooms were deserted. Drawers opened, rifled through. Oh my God! Oh my God! Dede could feel a mounting desperation. Tanita, who had come to work in the household for years ago when Jaime David was born, came running, alarmed by her mistress's screams. Why, Doña Dede, she said wide-eyed, it's only Don Jaimito who took the boys. Where? Dede could barely get it out. To Doña Leila's, I expect. He packed bags. Her mouth dropped open, surprised by something private that she wished she hadn't seen. How could you let them, Tanita? How could you? The boys have colds, she cried, as if that were the reason for her distress. Have Salvador saddled the mare, Dede ordered. Quick, Tanita, quick! For the maid was standing there rubbing her hands down the sides of her dress. Off Dede rode at a crazy canter all the way to Mama's. It was already dark when she turned in the drive, and the house was all lit up, cars in the driveway, Minerva, Manolo just arriving from Monte Cristi, Mate and Leonardo from the capital, and of course it would be a big weekend. But every thought of the meeting had faded from Dede's mind. She had told herself on the gallop over that she must stay calm so as not to alarm Mama, but the moment she dismounted she was crying. I need a ride. Quick! Mija, Mama kept asking. What is going on? Nothing, Mama, really. It's just Jaimito's taken the boys to San Francisco. But what's wrong with that? Mama was asking, suspicion deepening on the lines of her face. Is something wrong with that? By now, Manolo had brought the car around to the door, and Minerva was honking the horn, and off they went, Dede telling them her story of coming home and finding the house abandoned and the boys gone. Why would he do this? Minerva asked. She was digging through her purse for the cigarettes that she could not smoke in front of Mama. Recently, she had picked up a bad cough along with the smoking. He threatened to leave me if I got involved with your group. But you're not involved, Manolo defended her. Maybe Dede wants to be involved. Minerva turned around to face the back seat, and Dede could not make out her expression in the dim light. The end of her cigarette glowed like a bright, probing eye. Do you want to join us? Dede began to cry. I just have to admit to myself, I'm not you. No, really, I mean it. I could be brave if someone were by me every day of my life to remind me to be brave. I don't come by it naturally. None of us do, Minerva quoted quietly. Dede, you're plenty brave, Manolo asserted in his courtly way. Then, for they were already in the outskirts of San Francisco, he added, you're going to have to tell me where to turn. They pulled up behind the pickup parked in front of Doña Leila's handsome stucco house, and Dede's heart lifted. She had seen the boys through the open door of the front patio watching television. As they were getting out of the car, Minerva hooked arms with Dede. Manolo's right, you know. You're plenty brave. Then nodding towards Jaimito, who had come to the doorway with an aggressively blocking their way in, she added, "One struggle at a time, sister." "The liberators are here." Jaimito's voice was sloppy with emotion. Dede's arrival with Minerva and Manolo probably confirmed his suspicions. "What do you want?" he asked, hands gripping either side of the door frame. "My sons," Dede said, coming up on the porch. She felt brave with Minerva at her side. "My sons," he proclaimed, "are where they should be, safe and sound." "Why, cousin, don't you say hello?" Minerva chided him. He was curt in his greetings, and even to Manolo, whom he had always liked. They had together invested their wives' inheritance in that ridiculous project. What was it? Growing onions in some godforsaken desert area where you couldn't even get the Haitians to live? Dede had warned them. But Manolo's warmth could thaw any coldness, and he gave his old business partner un abrazo, addressing him as compadre, even though neither one was godparent to the other's children. He invited himself in, ruffled the boy's hair, and called out, "Doña Lela, where's my girl?" Obviously, the boys suspected nothing. They yielded reluctant kisses to their mother and aunt, and their eyes, all the while trained on the screen, where El Gato Tom and El Ratoncito Jerry were engaged in yet another of their battles. Doña Lela came out from her bedroom, ready to entertain. She looked coquettish in a fresh dress, her white hair pinned up with combs. "Manolo, Minerva, que placer!" But it was Dede whom she kept hugging. So he hadn't said anything to his mother. He wouldn't dare, Dede thought. Doña Lela had always doted on her daughter-in-law so much so that Dede sometimes worried that Lela's 5 daughters would resent her. But really, it was obvious they adored the sister-in-law cousin who encouraged them in their small rebellions against their possessive only brother. 7 years ago, when Don Jaime had died, Jaimito had taken on the man of the family role with a vengeance. Even his mother said he was worse than Don Jaime had ever been. "Sit down, please sit down." Doña Lela pointed to the most comfortable chairs, but she would not let go of Dede's hand. "Mama," Jaimito explained, "we all have something private to discuss. We'll talk outside." He addressed Manolo, avoiding his mother's eyes. Doña Lela hurried out to assess the porch. She turned on the garden lights, brought out her good rockers, served her guests a drink, and insisted Dede eat a pastelito snack. She was looking too thin. "Don't let me hold you up," she kept saying. Finally, they were alone. Jaimito turned the porch lights off, calling out to his mother that there were too many bugs, but Dede suspected yet that he found it easier to address their problems in the dark. "You think I don't know what you've been up to?" The agitation in his tone carried. Doña Lela called from inside. "You need another cervecita, mijo?" "No, no, Mama," Jaimito said, impatience creeping into his voice. "I told Dede," he addressed his in-laws, "I didn't want her getting mixed up in this thing." "I can assure you she's never been to any of our gatherings," Manolo put in, "on my word." Jaimito was silent. Manolo's statement had stopped him short, but he had already gone too far to readily admit that he had been wrong. "Well, what about her other meetings with Padre de Jesus? Everyone knows he's a flaming communist." "He is not," Minerva contradicted. "For heaven's sakes, Jaimito, I only went to see him once," Dede added, "and it was in reference to us, if you have to know the truth." "Us?" Jaimito stopped rocking himself, his bravado deflated. "What about us, Mami?" "Can you really be so blind?" she wanted to say. "We don't talk anymore. You boss me around. You keep to yourself. You're not interested in my garden." But Dede felt shy addressing their intimate problems in front of her sister and brother-in-law. "You know what I'm talking about." "Well, what is it, Mommy?" "Stop calling me Mommy. I am not your mother." Doña Lela's voice drifted from the kitchen where she was supervising her maid and frying a whole platter of snacks. "Another pastelito, Dede?" "She's been like that since the minute I got here," Jaimito confided. His voice had grown tender. He was loosening up. "She must have asked me 100 times, 'Where's Dede? Where's Dede?'" It was as close as he could get to admitting how he felt. "I have a suggestion, compadre," Manolo said. "Why don't you two take a honeymoon somewhere nice?" "The boys have colds," Dede said lamely. "Their grandmother will take very good care of them, I'm sure," Manolo laughed. "Why not go up to, wasn't it in Jarabacoa where you honeymooned?" "No, Rio San Juan, that area," Jaimito said, entering into the plan. "We went to Jarabacoa," Minerva reminded Manolo in a tight voice that suggested she disapproved of the reconciliation that he was engineering. Her sister was better off alone. They have a beautiful new hotel in Rio San Juan, Manolo went on. There's a balcony with each room and everyone with a sea view. I hear the prices are reasonable, Jaimito put in. It was as if the two men were working on another deal together. So, what do you say, Manolo concluded. Neither Jaimito nor Dede said a word. Then it's settled, Manolo said, but he must have felt the unsettledness in their silence, for he went on. Look, everyone has troubles. Minerva and I went through our own rough times. The important thing is to use a crisis like this to grow closer. Isn't that so, mi amor? Minerva's guard was still up. Some people can't ever really see eye to eye. Her statement broke the deadlock, though it was probably the last thing Minerva had intended. Jaimito's competitive streak was reawakened. Dede and I see perfectly eye to eye. The problem is other people confusing things. The problem is when I open my eyes and see for myself, Dede was thinking, but she was too shaken by the night's events and the long week of indecision to contradict him. And so it was that the weekend that there was to have become a watershed in Dede's life turned into a trip down memory lane in a rented boat. In and out of the famous lagoons that they had visited as a young bride and groom, Jaimito rowed, stopping to a point with his oar to the swamp of mangroves where the Taínos had fished and later hidden from the Spanish. Hadn't she heard him say so 11 years ago? And at night, sitting on their private balcony with Jaimito's arms around her and his promises in her ear, Dede gazed up at the stars. Recently, in Vanidades, she had read how starlight took years to travel down to earth. The star whose light she was now seeing could have gone out years ago. What comfort if she counted them? If in that dark heaven she traced a ram when already half its brilliant horn might be gone? False hopes, she thought. Let the nights be totally dark, but even that dark wish that she made on one of those stars. The roundup started by the end of the following week. Early that Saturday, Jaimito dropped off Dede at Mama's with the two youngest boys. Mama had asked for Dede's help planting a crown of thorns border, so that she said, but Dede knew what her mother really wanted. She was worried about her daughter after her panicked visit a week ago. She wouldn't ask Dede any questions. Mama always said that what went on in her daughter's marriages was their business. But just by watching Dede lay the small plants on the ground, Mama would know the doings in her heart. As Dede walked up the driveway assessing what still needed to be done in the yard, the boys raced each other to the door. They were swallowed up by the early morning silence of the house. It seemed odd that Mama had not come out to greet her. Then Dede noticed the servants gathered in the backyard and Tono breaking away, walking briskly towards her. Her face had that burdened look of someone about to deliver bad news. What? Tono, tell me. Dede found that she was clutching the woman's arm. Don Leandro has been arrested. Only him? Tono nodded, and shamefully in her heart, Dede was thankful that her sisters had been spared before she was frightened for Leonardo. Inside, Maria Teresa was sitting on the couch, unplaiting and plaiting her hair, her face puffy from crying, and Mama stood by, reminding her that everything was going to be all right. By habit, Dede swept her eyes across the room, looking for the boys. She heard them in one of the bedrooms, playing with their baby cousin, Jacqueline. She just got here, Mama was saying. I was about to send the boys for you. There was no phone lines out where the old house was, and another reason Mama had moved up to the main road. Dede sat down. Her knees always gave out on her when she was scared. What happened? Mate sobbed out her story, her breath wheezy with the asthma that she always got whenever she was upset. She and Leandro had been asleep just a couple of hours when they heard a knock that didn't wait for an answer. The SIM had broken down the door of their apartment, stormed inside, roughed up Leandro, and carried him away. Then they ransacked the house, ripped open the upholstery on the couch and chairs, and drove off in the new Chevrolet. Mate stopped, too short of breath to continue. But why? Why, Mama kept asking. Leandro's a serious boy, an engineer. Neither Mate nor Dede knew how to answer her. Dede tried calling Minerva in Montecristi, but the operator reported the line was dead. Now Mama, who had stood by accepting their shrugs for answers, leveled her gaze at each of them. What's going on here? And don't try to tell me nothing. I know something is going on. Mate flinched as if she knew that she had misbehaved. Mama, Dede said, knowing the time had come to offer their mother the truth, and she patted a space between them on the couch. You're going to have to sit down for this. Dede was the first to rush out when they heard the commotion in the front yard. What she saw made no sense at all. The servants were all on the front lawn now, and Fela was screaming, Ralito in her arms, and Nora stood by holding Manolito's hand, both of them crying. And there was Patria on her knees, rocking herself back and forth, pulling the grass out of the ground in handfuls. Slowly, Dede pieced together the story Patria was telling. The SIM had come for Pedrito and Nelson, who, alerted by some neighbors, had fled into the hills. Patria had answered the door, and the officers that her husband and son were away at the Capitol, but the SIM overran the place anyway. They scoured the property, dug up the fields, and found the buried boxes full of their incriminating cargo, as well as the old box of papers. Inflammatory materials, they called it, but all Patria saw were pretty notebooks written in a girlish hand. Probably something Norris had wanted to keep private from her nosy older brother and so hidden away in the grove. They tore the house apart, hauling away the doors, the windows, the priceless mahogany beams of Pedrito's old family rancho. It was like watching their life dismantled before their very eyes. Patria stood weeping that the glory she had trained on a vine, the Virgencita in the silver frame blessed by the Bishop of Uguay, the wardrobe with little ducks that she had stenciled on when Ralito was born, all of it violated, broken, desecrated, destroyed. Then they set fire to what was left. And Nelson and Pedrito, seeing the conflagration and fearing for Patria and the children, came running down from the hills, their hands over their heads, giving themselves up. I've been good, Patria was screaming at the sky. The ground around her was bare. The grass lay in sad clumps at her side. Why she did what she did next, Dede did not know. Grief driving her to salvage something, she supposed. Down she got on her knees and began tamping the grass back, and in a soothing voice, she reminded her sister of the faith that she had always sustained her. You believe in God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. Sobbing, Patria fell in, reciting the credo, Light of light, who for us men and for our salvation came down from heaven, Dede confirmed in a steady voice.